Hello, everybody. Welcome to our a little bit late starting, like 2 weeks program, but it's a beautiful day. We don't have to worry about snow today, that's for sure. So thanks for all coming back. I'm sure you were disappointed when you found out we were postponing. So if we could kind of get settled a little bit, we'll get started with our program. I'm Judy Matson. I'm with the Bonner Milltown History Center, and I would welcome you all here. I would like to call your attention to a couple people in the back. Miney Smith, you want to wave your hand? Miney's got hats that if you are interested in getting a neat hat, now that we have sunshine and you need shade, you can sign up to order one of those. Also want to invite Parker. Parker's our University of Montana intern in public history, and Parker's conducting a survey for us. So do you want to tell them a little bit about that, Parker?
Sure, thanks. So our survey is just a real quick anonymous survey to get a little bit more information about like who you are, how often you come to our events, and what sort of programming you would be interested in attending in the future, just so that we can plan programming that really suits the interests of you guys. If you've already filled out a survey, I super appreciate it. Thank you so much. If you haven't filled out a survey yet and you would like to, I would really appreciate it. If you just raise your hand, I can come bring you a survey and a pencil. Thanks so much.
Isn't it amazing to have an intern? This is so cool. Okay, so this is our 42nd roundtable. Isn't that hard to imagine? Some of you, I think, have been at all of them. These programs began in 2009, and we have had 110 speakers, more or less, probably more than, and each one of them has generously donated their time to give a talk. And they are committed to helping us keep our history alive, and we really appreciate that. No speaker has ever asked for payment for providing their time and expertise, and conversely, we have never charged admission for anyone to come to our programs because we all just want everyone to be able to enjoy history. I also, though, do want to recognize the generosity of donors who make this free programs possible. There are many of you in this room who are loyal donors, and we really appreciate you. And finally, if you haven't had a chance to become a supporter of the Bonner Milltown History Center yet, and you want to, we'd welcome you into the family. If you want to donate today, Anna and Cheryl and Robin and Callie have donation forms at their tables by the door, and on the tables that each of you are sitting at, there's also a QR code that you can scan if you prefer to donate like that. So we appreciate anything you feel that you can do. A couple quick notes. Most importantly, the bathroom locations. The men's is to right back there by the doors here. The women's, if you go to the merchandise room and turn right, it's on the right at the end of that hall. So that's something important you want to know. I want to thank MCAT for being here. Again, they've been here with us for all of our 42 programs. And Ron is here with us again today. They have given us a media assistance grant to provide this service for recording and making this possible to be seen later online. It will appear in approximately a month on channel 189, and then it will be on their website, video on demand. It will also be on the History Center's website, which is bonnermilltownhistory.org. So in about a month, if you want to see it again, or if you know somebody who wanted to come and couldn't, it'll be available. I want to thank the Kettle House. Their support in the history of this area is amazing, and their support of us is equally amazing. I hope that, and I can see that you are, by the number of beers that are being handed out today, support them. They have beer, hard seltzer, non-alcoholic house-made root beer, and hop water, and even regular water. There are also snacks available, and I thought there was going to be a food truck. Is that not happening today? So buy their snacks, and Cop beef sticks are great for a snack. Thanks too to Friends of Two Rivers, who have sponsored the Bonner Milltown History Center from the beginning. And to Walter, our wonderful sound technician, who is always here making sure that everybody can hear. And finally, I'd like to thank Steve Nelson, Mike Boehm, and Mike Heisey of Bonner Property Development. They provide free of charge the home for the Bonner Milltown History Center in the post office building. And I hope you can all come and visit us at some point. We are open to the public Wednesdays from 10 until noon. And then on Tuesdays, we have a bit of a greater enticement from 9 to noon. The coffee group is there, and they have wonderful treats and awesome conversation. And then if you are a curious type, come on Friday to Old Roads and Rabbit Holes. And they started out talking about old roads and soon learned they were delving down lots of rabbit holes, so they changed their name to be appropriate, 10 o'clock every Friday, and everybody's welcome. So we are going to, as we always do, have a traveling mic for the question session. So raise your hand and please wait for the mic to come to you so that everybody can hear your question. And also, if you wouldn't mind saying your name, that would be helpful too. About partway through the program, Sally has an intermission built in, and that's going to give us a chance to get up, stretch our legs a little bit, buy a beer, buy a book of Sally's, use the restroom, and so forth. And speaking of Sally's books, we do have a supply of them available for sale today. If you haven't read either of them yet, you're in for a huge treat. And if you have read them, you're going to want to get a gift for a friend, because that would be an awesome way to show your friendship. So those are going to be on sale. They're on sale now, and that's going to end. We'll sell them during the intermission, and then after the program, we'll sell them again, and at that time, Sally will sign them for anyone who wants a signed copy. Okay, that does it for the announcements, and now Kim Brigham will introduce Sally. Where's Kim? There he is. He's way in the back.
So one thing that Judy Matson forgot to do is introduce Judy Matson. If not for her, we wouldn't be here. She's been our fearless leader for well over a decade now, and things are happening all of the time, and Judy's largely to blame or gets credit for. So it's my job to introduce Sally Thompson. Sally's recent books, both of them which were published just last year, Disturbing the Sleeping Buffalo, 23 Stories That Awaken Montana's Past, published by Far Country Press. And I don't have a copy in front of me, but Black Robes, Enter Coyote's World, Chief Charlo and Father DeSmet in the Rocky Mountains by the University of Nebraska Press. Highly professional but eminently readable books that I strongly recommend to both of you, all of you. In the introduction to Sleeping Buffalo, she titles it An Ear to the Ground, Listening to the Heartbeat of History. And I think that goes a long way to explaining Sally's approach. We advertised her as an anthropologist, a historian, an author, but we could go on and on about it, and not to embarrass her, but even she was very active before and during the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. She produced 2 short documentaries from the tribal points of view. As director of UM's Continuing Educational Regional Learning Project, I think I got that right, she co-published a unique collection of historical maps of Montana. I don't know if you've seen these maps, but they span a 120-year time frame starting in 1778. They're incredible maps. 10 years before these 2 latest books, she published another one, People Before the Park, the Kootenai and Blackfeet before Glacier National Park. So I'm going to steal something from the back cover of Sleeping Buffalo. It says, "The past still lingers along old trails and among the people who live here today. Some, such as Sally Thompson, are better equipped to notice the traces of history lurking in place names and written in cairns, carved in tree bark, etched into prairie boulders, or resting among well-knapped spear points." Sally?
To figure out how to make you hear me. Can you hear me in the back now? Okay, great. Well, I'll have to say I'm amazed at the number of you who would come out on a sunny Sunday, after a long winter already. But thank you so much for being here. And Judy and Kim, both thank you for. Judy, I should bring you with me whenever I'm trying to sell books. Nice hype there. You can see why none of us asked to be compensated for coming to be able to talk to this group, because what a wonderful group of people dedicated to something really important. And I love just contributing what I can to this effort. Today, because the group usually focuses on the Blackfoot much more than the Clark Fork. And I decided I would focus on the upper Clark Fork because of an opportunity I had in the 90s to work on the ARCO case with the Confederated Tribes. Those of you who remember, they went in on the state's lawsuit against ARCO for, in the case of the tribes, for the loss of off-reservation treaty rights. So in the 1855 treaty, they were guaranteed the right to continue to be able to hunt, fish, and gather in traditional areas that were open and unclaimed. And the rivers were part of that. And so my job was to try and help quantify the losses in fish income and whatever other ways they were benefiting from the waters in the Clark Fork. So it was a pretty big challenge to try and do that. Originally, they thought about doing archaeological work, and that seemed to me like much harder than finding a needle in a haystack, because fish bones in early archaeological work, nobody was able to do such fine work as to get the fish bones, and even the equipment connected to fishing has rarely been found on the Clark Fork. A couple of cases with net weight sinkers, and I think maybe one fish hook on the lower Clark Fork. Anyway, even if you found that, you couldn't guarantee it was the Salish or Kootenays or anybody on the Confederated Flathead Nation. So it could have been Nez Perce or other Western tribes that would go take the same corridor to go to the buffalo. So anyway, we developed a multi-pronged approach, and I'm going to tell you about things I learned along the way during the years we worked on that project. The one thing I won't say much about is the archaeological finds, because they're held in confidence. That's the intellectual property of the tribes, and because of sensitive nature of where some of their early sites were, I'm just bound not to talk about that. So other than generically, I was warned about putting my head down and the noise it would make. Okay, it'll take me just a minute to get this routine down. Okay, so we started off with going with the tribal committee up to learn about the EPA's plan and to take us to places where we could see some of the damage done by the smelter and mining. And the devastation is so extreme. And we couldn't even, it was hard to relate to the places that they had stories about. In some of the places were just so devastated you couldn't tell. But elders are remarkable in remembering, even just from the stories. The stories keep places alive even when they're damaged. But what I learned going up and down the Clark Fork during these years was to slow down. You know, I'd been in Montana 15 years at that point, and my knowledge of the Upper Clark Fork was 70 miles an hour. And the difference is just remarkable, taking the frontage roads and going slowly and stopping where you can. And those of you who live around here and do a lot of that, like the Friday gang at the Old Roads group, they're always doing this kind of exploration and with great pleasure, and then they have a much deeper connection and sense of place than most people do anymore. So that was a huge gift to me to be able to start slowing down. So these were the elders I worked with. One really important part of the information that went into the project was their collective memories, the oral histories of different places up and down the Clark Fork that were important to the Salish and Kalispel people. None of them are still with us, but so you may recognize some of them, like Louis Adams. Just need to find myself on my notes here. Okay. Agnes Poker Jim Paul was born in 1910, and she remembered fishing camps where now the Doubletree sits. Sophie Moise, who was Louis Adams' grandmother, she was born in 1864 in a fish camp where Eastgate Shopping Center now sits. And their ancestors had valued these places since time immemorial, especially those confluence sites, like where we sit now and where their families fished, are always the most important places because they're so rich in foods, resources, both on the land and the water. Do you all know this piece? Some of you. So Nicholas Point, who was one of the Jesuits who came with Father de Smet in 1841, sketched this. And it's really funny. I have looked at this so many times. And this morning, in going back over the slides, I zoomed in on the foreground and the people in it. I never looked at it. Now, if I had a hand lens, and because zooming in, it got a little blurry, but that's a child. That's a little Salish family. And the top hat usually is associated with one of the chiefs, but I just had never, I thought, from a distance, I thought it was like a white guy and an Indian sitting by the water, right? Well, okay, so that's at Eastgate, right? So that's where Sophie Moise was born, in that same location. This is one of my favorite things, is figuring out where these historic images actually are in our reality, right? So then looking here, it's kind of this same image. And when I used to look at the point, the mountains, Mount Sentinel, I thought, oh, that's just too extreme, I wonder why he didn't make it more like it looks. And then sitting on the deck at Finn one day with that image, I thought, it's exactly what it looks like from this angle. I just hadn't looked at it from that point of view. And you can see, looking at the two, that it's a slightly different perspective, but he did a darn good job. Because sometimes you want to know how much leeway did people take when they were sketching. Were they trying to make the mountains look cooler, bigger, more impressive, or not? And so this is a pretty good validation of Point's accuracy. So Carling Malouf, who was an archaeologist at the university, drew this many years ago, showing the possibility of people around the edges of glacial Lake Missoula. And I think there were periods where people thought that was nonsensical, and now I think it's nonsensical to think it's not true. People were here. And in some ways, this has become obsessive, for archaeologists, and trying to determine who came when and where from. And a woman of the Wasco Nation on the Columbia River once said to me, I think it's like Europeans and the competition for who came first. And, did your family come on the Mayflower? And, oh, your family didn't come until then? Kind of this. And she said, I think that's the only reason it's so important for others to try and nail us down for how long we've been here. But, at some point, if you've been here for 1,000 years or 10,000 years or 20,000 years, any of those are a long time, and you have this deep relationship with the place compared to somebody who's just recently moved here. And that's what really matters, right? A deep connection, because then you're a steward. Those of you who are multi-generation Montanans and you have families that are bound to the land, you understand this. But then you just imagine it, times 100, and how much love you have for the place that has sustained you and your people. So kind of getting away from who cares how many years. So one source of information on our project was me reading everything I could get my hands on. And I'm just going to admit here, Father de Smet is written in large letters because I became obsessed with his writing and him in a lot of ways. And that was a long time ago, and I continued the obsession to the point where finally kind of the culmination in the Black Robes book, which originally was going to be called Following Father de Smet Through Indian Country. Then I kind of got bored following Father de Smet, and it became a whole different book. But I went to Europe, to Belgium, to his hometown. I went to the Jesuit archives in Rome. I really followed the guy everywhere, and kind of feel like I might have been reincarnated from him. We have a lot of the same obsessions, actually. So, in addition to those outsider points of view, the local histories were really important. And I highly recommend this Darlene Olson's book on Rock Creek. I know you can read it at the library. I'm not sure that it's available in print anymore. But really rich. She got a lot of the oral history from Rock Creek, and great stories in there. So then the source of information that really became the most important was the interviews with descendants of homestead families. And I had just had an inkling from, I think I read somebody talking to somebody up at Bearmouth, and they remembered that the Salish would always show up around the time the geese returned. Or at some time, like springtime, they remembered soon after the geese returned, they would expect the Salish to come. And I thought, oh, these are people on the land, they're paying attention. That might be where we'll actually get specific information about losses on the Clark Fork, where it's attributed to the Salish people, not to maybe anybody who was traveling through, not to Indians in general. So many of you probably knew Willie Bateman. I know the locals did. He was an active part of this group, I think, and really knowledgeable. And so many wonderful people that were generous in the way Judy is and talks about, really wanting to keep this place alive through the stories in the same way Native people do. So one thing that came out of this is how often people talked about, even people that I was talking to, remembering in their childhood, so not their grandparents, but their own childhood, even into the 1920s, Salish people still coming up the river. Now that really threw me off. I don't know how many of you might have the same assumption that once people were on the reservation, that's where they lived. But the seasonal routes continued as long as they possibly could. And really, it seemed like until the pollution from the stack got so bad that they stopped going at least to the upper part of the watershed, and then continued to still come up to at least to Rock Creek area for a long time. And that was shocking to me. And then looking into the reasons that might have been, well, the Salish, the Bitterroot Salish were not on the reservation until they were forced to go there in 1891. But even the Kalispay on the reservation, there wasn't enough food. The agents weren't distributing food. one thing in reading the intimate stories from people that were living here and writing about it at the time, there were a lot of years where animals were wiped out by hard winters, like frozen in their tracks kind of deaths, and then really, really rough summers often. And so then you combine that with all sorts of newcomers in the area who are competing for the same food sources once the buffalo were gone. So, you get to the 1870s, and even though the Salish are still going over the mountains for buffalo, they're over there for 10 months of the year. They're only on this side of the mountains 2 months because they are scrounging for food. It's hard to find buffalo long before they were completely gone. And then once they were gone, you have more and more and more non-Indian settlers all around competing for the same sources with no controls on hunting. So food was scarce. So they were going wherever they could to their old places, and fishing was more important than ever because that was a source that they could count on in certain places. One woman from this neighborhood, from Clinton, Gail Wynn, told me that her father learned that the Salish would come up when they came up in the spring. They would check the sloughs and see if there was a healthy population of trout. And if they saw multiple age groups represented, they would fish that stream. And if they didn't, then they would leave it. And then they'd check every year and decide to fish that way. And that's such a beautiful example of sustainable harvests, right? Let's just protect those streams that are already suffering. So Dale Karkinen, who's somebody that some of you knew, he remembered Sam Resurrection, who would stop at Dale's grandmother's boarding house in Milltown, and Ernie Hunt, who used to hunt timbers from the Mission Valley, now used to be in this area. He remembered Sam would camp on their place between Piltsville and Tura on the north side of the valley. And in earlier years, they'd camped right where the Hunt house was. And the story was he traded herbs for bootleg whiskey. The photo caption there tells that he sold whitefish in gunny sacks in the winter of 1908. And then that Poker Jim, Agnes Paul's father, did the same. Have any of you heard of Sam Resurrection? And that he was renamed Resurrection because he was dead and resurrected, and multiple observers would witness that, so they renamed him, that he came back to life. And he lived a long life, actually, then. This was Betty's friend. So about 1915, when Rita Thibodeau Lavoie was about 10 years old, she remembered meeting Mary Ann Combs. And Mary Ann was the last living Salish, Bitterroot Salish person who had come on the Trail of Tears, who had been forced to the res in 1891. And she was a lovely woman that everyone who got to know her just would talk about what a really incredible person she was. And Rita remembered that not long after the streetcars were installed, the Indians stopped coming. So you just think about the kinds of industrial changes that made places either inaccessible or difficult, and so old habits were left behind. So that was one thing, apparently, the streetcars and everything else that was going along with that. John Moe remembered in the 20s and 30s families still coming through on foot and horseback, maybe every now and in a real old car. They fished below the dam, below Milltown Dam, because above the dam, the river ran yellow and orange year-round. There were no fish there. That was his quote. Dale Karkinen lived on Highway 10, and he remembered a guy that used to come by with his buffalo and cart. This was a great example of how one person would remember one little piece, somebody else would remember another, and you had to put them all together to make the story work. So Ernie Hunt remembered seeing this man change the heavy leather shoes on the critter, probably buffalo hide, he thought. Bud Weaver from Lower Rock Creek remembered a fellow tall and thin with his cattle load and cart. The guy told Bud to get on this animal, ride him, which he did. Then the man told the beast to buck him off, and Bud soon found himself on the ground. Well, I have to confess, when I went back through all these notes to prepare this talk, I realized I have the wrong person in my book, Disturbing the Sleeping Buffalo. This story is in there, and I have it attributed to the wrong person. I'm really sorry and embarrassed, but there it is. So if you happen to read that and you go, well, that's not what she said, I was wrong. So this is correct. The book is wrong. If there's ever another edition, I'll try and make good on that. Anyway, I got really curious about this story, right? That four different people remembered this man, this mystery man who'd come through. And so I blew up the image from the Karkinen family, and then I could read where the cart was from. And then, because you can learn anything on the internet now, I found lots of postcards from these people. From the animal's name was Jumbo, and the guy's Leland Wilson. Well, there's this is in the book, and it's really fascinating history about cattle, concerns of cattlemen about how these cattle Herefords, Angus, they're bred in a completely different environment in the British Isles, and they really weren't built for dealing with Western winters. So the whole cattle industry was experimenting in this era with interbreeding, what we now call beefalo, but then it was cattle-lo. And there's some interesting articles by researchers at the time talking about the pros and cons of these hybrids. So going on up the river, Kramer Creek and Beavertail Hill, when you're driving up and off to the north side, when you're just about to go across Beavertail Hill, used to go up and over or around, you'll see a little ranch house off to the north there that is kind of blocked by the interstate. And I remember Wanda talking about how those old ranches before the interstate, they just carried down to the river, and you'd ride your horse from down or walk down and enjoy this beautiful scene. And then the interstate just took this, and people were not adequately compensated. Do any of you have this story in your own families? Because a lot of places going up the Clark Fork, the Cook family really lost access to a big part of their property. They just, sorry, the interstate's going to take it. Anyway, I just feel like it was a really rich area and lots of Salish camping in that vicinity. And then there was a trail up Kramer Creek and over, dropping down into the Blackfoot, where they could access Camas. And then there's stories about how the women, as long as they could, would ask the farmers if they could follow the plows, and then gather the roots, until they were just all gone from too much plowing. But as long as the Camas were there, it's just such a pitiful picture to me to think about these women having to basically beg to just follow a plow that's tearing up this age-old food source that every year that they would gratefully, anticipate and then go. I got to go to a Bitterroot, I haven't done this with Camas, but a Bitterroot feast, and sat with the elders. The older women tend to sit in a circle and peel the roots. So younger people that their backs are still good, or they're digging, and the women dig, men don't it's a cultural rule. And the tactile, the whole memory of the tactile experience of just, you just do this and the covering comes off of the roots. And the smell is incredible. And then you're visiting, with your family and friends, and just, think that's part of your life cycle. And every spring after a long winter, you anticipate that. And then this life comes where you can't even access your old gathering places anymore. So all of this work, both for me, was joyful and always sad. And, I think you can get a sense of that so much loss. Wanda told a story about a man named Charlie Thomas, who was Cherokee and African American, who settled on Kramer Creek after serving time in prison, and he was buried in their field. He worked for her father and ended up just like, what was his story? Wonder if we can, I haven't pursued that one. It'd be interesting to know. And then on the other side of Beavertail Hill. So Beavertail Hill, we used to just completely block where we now go on the interstate. And there are Salish stories about the impact of that beaver tail that blocked the river in that spot, or made it turn. On the other side of it, though, so still on the north side of the Clark Fork and the interstate, but on the east side of Beavertail Hill, the Weston family homesteaded, and I got to interview the two, at that time, old men, but the sons of the homesteader, Ben and Buzz. I believe they were bachelor brothers, and they were still living there. And they remembered that before World War II, on the old highway in the summer, every now and then a vehicle would come by. In the winter, no one did. Just to imagine, not just along the old road, they were just out there completely isolated all winter long. And just how much life has changed, and how much the highway changes our perspective and perception. Not only going so fast, but how much it's distorted the landscape. And everything now we relate to the road rather than the river, where in the past it would have been the river. So it's really kind of hard to keep reminding yourself to kind of peel away that stuff and try to imagine it the way it was. Bud Weaver remembered a story from his dad about a hanging tree that he thought was around Harvey Creek. Has anybody ever heard that? He said there was an old fence around it. On Rock Creek, we had a number of story circles, upper, mid, and lower Rock Creek. And a lot of families around there are like the Bonner folks, just really holding on. A lot of them have been there a long time and remembered history. And I was thinking about how at Ekstrom's, which was a stage stop back when, that in 1872, James Garfield, who had come out to negotiate with the Bitterroot Salish, try and get him off the land, he rode back that way, went to Deer Lodge to then leave Montana. And the story about that he forged Chief Charlot's signature on the agreement, because some of the, like Chief Charlot agreed to move and took the deal, and Charlot said, "I'm never going to sell out. I'm just not doing it," And but when that document got back to Washington D.C., his X was next to his name. So I was thinking, there's James Garfield in this riding along in this stagecoach, and he wrote about the changes along the river from where the Mullen Road used to be. So in 1872, the Mullen Road in many places was already changed. But whether it was then that he made the decision to just go ahead and forge Charlot's signature. Anyway, one thing in doing the research for the book, I learned that he wrote a letter to his wife explaining he's going to have to give eventually, so we might as well just act like he already has, basically. Yeah. Doris Ekstrom she was born in 1920, and she reported that Indians used to camp near their place, and Sam Resurrection continued to come with horse and buggy, and he would go up the creek and fish. So that's a McKay photo, so it's probably 1905 to 1910. And this is in the 20s that she remembers him coming, and he's already a pretty old guy in this picture, right? Oh, no. I hope I'm not saying anything I'm not supposed to. Sam is making his presence known. Did anybody here ever meet Aeneas Vanderburg? So the Vanderburg family is really important in Bitterroot Salish history, and one of the three leaders that brought people on the 1891 journey was the Vanderburg ancestor. And Aeneas was an incredible man. So, well, you can see it, right? You see he was a joyful person, but he was so sharp in this very understated way, just incredibly in tune. And he had remembered that they would come up to the mouth of Rock Creek, which was an important camp area in general, that whole, again, a confluence area. It's just rich in resources. And they'd camp on the north side, but then take a cable thing across the river to hunt and fish. And I was like, wonder what he's talking about. And then found that in the university archives. Anybody here have any history, knowledge of this? Well, if somebody does, let me know later. There's some really interesting history as we're going up the road, but I don't have time to talk about everything. But there was another medicine tree up there. You know, there's the famous one in the Bitterroot, but there was one called Medicine Tree Hill along the Clark Fork on the south side. And then an old hot spring in there that the remnant is still visible, where people pull over where they're not supposed to and soak. But around Bearmouth, I was already there. So, you know, the old Mullen Road went around the canyon, and probably for various reasons, but one is that later on, once the trains were going through, they realized it was a really vulnerable spot for being picked off. And so there were several train robberies in there. But it was a sacred place to the tribes because of the red ochre there. And there's known to be rock pictographs, rock art on the north side. And one oral history interview I read with a settler from the Bearmouth area said that there were also pictographs on the south side. I've always wondered about how the heck you can get there with the railroad and the river. It's kind of cut off, but I've never heard anyone else mention that. Beautiful on the backside. If you ever you don't want to go on a rainy day with that red gumbo, but it's a beautiful drive, the back way into Drummond. Just remarkable. You know, you're going after the canyon and Bearmouth area, then there's that beautiful cliff to the south, and you wonder what's the back, and it's a gentle grade leading to this high country where the Mullen Road goes through. Well, in doing the research, I knew there were that archaeologists had reported artifacts on the hills to the just there on the left side of the photograph. And they were saying, you know, maybe there was a teepee camp there, but they didn't find evidence of teepees. But it's all sloping. There would be no way you'd be trying to sleep on that. And it just happened that Jermaine White and I were driving around that day. She's Salish, and there were bitterroots in bloom and all over those hills. So the implements that had been found, the flake tools, were about that help with the cleaning up of the roots. And so that was kind of a fun thing to put together. Again, often, you know, there's one piece of information that won't tell you the story, you know, that you need two or three to go, oh, I get it. So, did anyone know Ed Lannon from Bearmouth? Okay. Ed's face tells a story, doesn't it? He had a rough life. So there's an interview with a woman named Hazel Marsh, who was raised by the Lannon family. And the story's about the stage stop. I mean, kind of focused on that at Bearmouth. And she's reported that in the winter, the stage was a sled, big old sled, and that people were wrapped in buffalo robes to stay warm. Just such a great image that if she didn't report that, you don't see that anywhere else, and nobody's alive to remember it. When she was a young child, and she was born in 1906, she remembered that bands of Indians passed through the valley on their way to hunt. So just so many people confirming, even as far up as Bearmouth, and that her family, the Lannons, often hired them to pick the potatoes in the fall. The Lannons had homesteaded on the north side of the Clark Fork in 1865, and they ran a ferry back and forth there. And then later, Ed's grandfather had a cabin on Lower Willow Creek, 12 miles from Bearmouth, where he started up a ranch in 1878. Well, it's going to be a critical time period. So one morning, he headed out from Bearmouth to go up to his place, and he saw an Indian, and they started riding together. And I'm paraphrasing from Hazel Marsh's interview. Lannon offered tobacco, but the man refused it. That's a bad sign. Tobacco's a way you make an agreement with somebody. You trust each other, because tobacco carries smoke to the Creator. So it's a spiritual connection, and if somebody says, no thanks, there's something wrong. So Lannon was aware that the Indian kept trying to position himself by the butt end of Lannon's rifle. So he kept going around to the other side. And then the granddad noticed smoke on Pearson's section, which he understood were smoke signals, and he expected trouble. So I think Ed said he wasn't sure how his granddad got away. He didn't know if he killed the man or how he got away, but his memory was that his granddad took his horse, saddle, and dog and hid in the brush. And before long, he saw his cabin was on fire. So as described in the book Yellow Wolf, written by Nez Perce with the help of a historian, their place had been burned by Nez Perce, and they had escaped the Bear Paw battle and had wintered over in Canada, and then were trying to find their way back home. And some of them were kind of rogue. They were angry, upset. They were having trouble. They were hated, right? People had been so terrified the Nez Perce flight in 1877, even though, they're the ones who got the short end of that stick. People were afraid. So I'm just trying to picture how come what happened, that they burned the guy's cabin, and then they went on up and killed 3 miners in Upper Rock Creek. And only Nez Perce Jones survived. So those of you who've been to Peaburg, you've seen there's a statue of Nez Perce Jones, and he had his story kept growing and growing in terms of how far he went and all his travails to survive. So I'll come back to that story. The Flint Creek area is probably the richest in terms of families that have stayed on the land, and probably for the same reasons that the Salish, it was a second home. And there's some really early indications that there was a separate band of Salish that used to be centered in the Flint Creek area before disease took so many people away and bands consolidated. So I ended up spending a lot of time with homestead families in the Flint Creek Valley and learned so much. There's a house, another one of these houses that got completely kind of ruined by the interstate. It's just before you get into Drummond on the left, and it's not the old farmhouse, which is there also, but kind of a split level sitting there. And I was interviewing her, and she couldn't go up and down stairs anymore, so we're on the lower level, and all you can see out the window is the kind of the tops of semis going by. And before that, it was this gentle landscape down to the river of their big ranch. And again, they did not get adequate compensation for what happened to their lives after that, you know. But she could remember a story of I'm remembering a line of Indians, you know, they often either call them Indians or flatheads. But she said like a mile long, and that they had stopped someplace and put on their finery, which is often they would travel with a little suitcase and put on their good clothing for something important. But of course, they'd wear their jeans, their daily fare normally. So I think that actually there was an event in the 1940s. It was before the war. I don't remember which year, where Deer Lodge put on a big event where all the tribes that used to come through were invited. And I haven't done research on this. It's just, again, some threads started to come together when I was putting this talk together. So I don't think it was a normal event, that what she witnessed, but of course it was big in her mind. But I think she was witnessing a one-time event. So they were traveling to take part in like a giant rodeo in Deer Lodge. And I do have some pictures from that Lee Silliman provided. So there's probably somebody who really knows that history, but I don't. Agnes Poker Jim Paul had said that the city park right there in Drummond was a camp, a major camp. When she was young, they used to go there. And they would stay about a week to fish and gather. And there were bighorns across the river to the north. One story that's in Disturbing the Sleeping Buffalo is about William Hamilton, and who wrote a big epic that was published by the Historical Society in 1900 or 1902 or something. And I don't believe much of what's in there, and that's what the story that's in Sleeping Buffalo is about, the part of the story dealing with the Kootenays, and it's just over the top, you know. And I started questioning how could that even be true, and so I actually am not positive, but I don't believe much of what he said. But the part he was the first sheriff of Missoula County, and I came to understand that meant you were good with the gun. You know, you didn't have to have a lot of credentials to be the sheriff in those days. But the part of the story that I do believe, he was coming up the Clark Fork and camped near Drummond, and then some Salish scouts came to inquire what he and his friend were doing. He was traveling with a mixed blood Nez Perce man, and they were posing as traders, but they were really gathering information for the U.S. Army. And I think there's probably some truth to that, but I've not found any verification of it. Anyway, they wanted to know, and they became friendly, and so the traders traveled with these Salish scouts over. It would be like the Helmville Road, right? Have any of you taken that road north from Drummond instead of staying on the interstate? So it would have traveled up there and over into the Blackfoot, where they then camped with Victor's people. And in this case, I believe it because he actually names people that are real. With the Kootenays, he didn't. None of the names lined up. But so he's with Chief Victor's camp. He talks about bear tracks. He mentions Victor's son, who I'm assuming is Charlo. Charlo, like there's almost no mention of him until he becomes chief at the age of 40, which is kind of interesting, you know. There's just nothing about him. So here's this one moment in history where the chief's son is helping to put the horses away or something. Anyway, there was a story that I hadn't planned to mention, but have any of you read the story about Granville Stewart and Party are in 1857, I think they're camped in the Flint Creek Valley, and somebody says yes. Probably several of you know the story where they wake up and their horses are gone, and the evidence of who took them is the worn out moccasins that have been hung in the tree. Like, thanks, And it was Blackfeet, and the Salish then got on the few horses that were still there and tried to, because there were some Salish camped with them, and they tried to catch them, but then Stewart reported that once it got to the Continental Divide, that was the edge of their territory at that time, and the Blackfeet defended the other side so well that they didn't venture any farther, and so they didn't get their horses back. Anybody been to New Chicago? Number of you. I love the name, right? It was on the Mullen Road, and they had high hopes for the place until they decided to put the railroad down by what became Drummond and kind of killed old New Chicago. I stopped there and spoke to a woman at the bar who I told her what I was doing, and she said, I remember a story that kind of came along with the bar. I can't remember if it was her own family or not, but she said one time an Indian man was riding down the road here on his horse, and a guy went out of the bar and shot and killed him. But my memory is, and again, don't quote me on this because I'd have to go back and double check, but I think she said the people went and grabbed the guy who shot the Indian and hung him. The immediate justice, they just felt like that was completely wrong. And I really hope that's true. It'd be one of the few stories of some kind of justice on that side, even though I'm really against capital punishment, but it was a different world then.
Okay, we've gone a little past our time because everybody's having a great visit. Could we get settled again, and we'll finish the talk, and then we'll have some questions. You'll get a chance to have Sally sign your books, so I know that you're looking forward to that. So I've got another exciting announcement for you as soon as you're able to hear it. I know that in 2 weeks you're going to be wanting to hear more about the Clark Fork River because it's a topic that we in our 15 years have never covered. And now not only do we have this wonderful research that Sally did before the cleanup project started, but on the 16th, we are going to have the topic is removing the Milltown Dam and restoring the Clark Fork River. So it's not going to be as pristine as the information that Sally's telling us about, but we actually have people coming to us in the History Center and saying, hey, did you know there used to be a dam over there in the Clark Fork River? So for all of us who are remembering those days of the cleanup, and for all the new people who didn't know that there's something to be learned, on March 16th, we're going to be down at St. Anne Church, not here this time, but at the church. 1 o'clock again, we've got a new starting time. And so we're going to have a panel of 4 of the principals in the cleanup. Peter Nielsen, representing Missoula County. Doug Martin, representing the Natural Damage Research Program that did the restoration. Diana Hammer is going to represent Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. And then Mike Custudia, who was involved throughout, but ended up as the first manager of Milltown State Park, now retired. So it's going to be a great program. Many of the people in the audience today were involved in the cleanup project as well, so we'll have a traveling mic and people can share their memories. And it's going to be a wonderful opportunity to bring ourselves up to speed on those days. One reminder, Sally is going to be signing her books after the program, so you can look forward to that. And finally, after our program on the 16th, it's Pasty Day. We traditionally partner with St. Anne Parish, and they make Better Than Butte pasties and serve them on the site. You can eat there or take them home. They're delicious, so look forward to that. Any other comments that we need to make, Kim or anybody? Okay, Sally, it's all yours.
All right. Before I get started, I want to mention a book that has just come out, written by my friend Donna Erickson, who's sitting right here. It's called Rooted at the Edge, and it's a story of growing up on one of the North Hills ranches and the challenges of trying to be an ag family at the edge of a growing community. It's a wonderful book, brand new. She's having an event to launch it on the 3rd of April at the, come on, Donna. Garden City Harvest on River Road. There'll be advertisements around, but I encourage you to go. During the break, I was mentioning to somebody about what a privilege it was to be able to work with these old timers up and down the river. The people who carried the most information were those who were grandchildren of the homesteaders. And although there were some I mentioned earlier that homesteaded in the 1860s, most of the ones up Flint Creek were 1880-ish. And so the grandkids that hung out with their grandparents and really listened. Usually there'd be one in the family that was that kid. And they carried the stories just like they'd been there. You know, so things that the grandparents lived through that they then carried and could tell me. And just what a privilege, because they were like different people than you'd meet anymore. You know, ranching's changed so much, and the difficulty of having you all know. Anyway, I just feel really fortunate to have been able to get to know them as well as the Salish elders of that same vintage. So the Flint Creek Valley, I think it's one of the prettiest places in Montana. Love that area. It's changing quickly like every place else, right? With investors everywhere. Some of the people that carry on the stories that help me understand it include Keith Graybeal, who probably knew more than anybody in the valley, and he generously, talk about people who give their time, he took me everywhere, introduced me to anybody who would be able to help with the project, and he was a great guy. Anyway, he had a major archaeological site on his land, and many homesteads were built on important campsites, right? Because they were the best places. They usually had a spring, something solid to keep people there. And Native people didn't lug their big heavy artifacts around with them. The tools that were always used that time of year in that location, whatever they were processing there, they would leave those tools there. They'd stash them under some bushes and even teepee poles. And so everything was just there for them when they would come back the next year. Well, archaeologists rarely find these things because they're on homestead properties where the landowners have collected them. So that's where you really see the amazing collections and kind of the daily life kind of things, rather than kind of archaeologists often find kill sites, say, you know, and so you get a lot of spear points, but kind of more focused on one resource as opposed to daily life over a long period and year after year. And so Keith had an incredible collection. And one thing that I learned from doing this work is from the elders that the West Side tribes never made pemmican where you'd mash the berries with the meat, they kept them separate. You'd have different implements. It was like a big no-no to mix the two. And for some reason, because of that, the stains that you would get on Salish pestles are pronounced, the dark berry stains. So you can see that on some of these. And so they'd be different than if you were looking at a Blackfeet campsite. And then you get a different kind of polish with all the fat and meat going into it. A couple of the unique artifacts that were found someplace on the Clark Fork or Flint Creek. The one in the middle is really an amazing item. The material is probably from British Columbia, and it's a style of, it's kind of a wedge or a multi-purpose axe. The style is more like some Alaskan artifacts. Weber, did you ever see anything like this up there? I had to look far and wide to even find a similar tool, but this would have been a high value trade item. And I wouldn't doubt that it had been buried with a person as an important object. Then on the far right, Carleen Maloof wrote an article once on mystery objects. And it's these giant, club-like things, and they vary maybe from 14 inches up to this thing that's almost 3 feet, 2.5 feet anyway. And, it takes a particular geological process that kind of cross beds so that they don't break. How you get something this long and you're using it forcefully for one thing or another. Salish and Kootenai women have told me that these were involved in hide processing. Some of them have grooves marking something like counting marks. I've seen a couple with designs on them, not just the marks. So can't say anything more. I never heard anybody give more specific information or see them in action. But Jim Sears, geologist from the university, told me that there's one place, can't think now, it was a minor place in Montana where you maybe could find pieces of that size to make an object like this, but more in central Idaho, particular geology. And I'm sorry, I didn't look that up again, and I don't remember. When you get to be the age of many of us here, we can just say that. Right? I just don't remember. I remembered 2 weeks ago when I was supposed to give the talk, but it's gone now. Not really. So some of you have seen maps that say Arrowstone River on the Clark Fork. And the Arrowstone is this devil's eyebrow church. And so Bill Ormond, some of you may have known Bill and his artwork. It's right on the main road going up to Peaburg on the right-hand side there near New Chicago. Wonderful man. Another guy who generously shared with me whatever he knew, and took me to Eyebrow Mountain, which is in the lower part of the valley to the west. But you can see why it's called Eyebrow. So, and then it's Eyebrow Church because of that. And until metal tools took over, this was one of the main sources of tool making for the Salish. Here's some samples of what that material looks like. And this is a Marshall Creek that's up there off of Willow Creek. And there was no date on this. It was a family photograph that someone shared with me near a camas field. And everybody in that area remembers Salish camping, and again, that kind of pattern of coming in the spring. And imagine the bitterroots in the Missoula Valley, Bitterroot Valley, ripening at a certain time and then progressing as you go up elevation, up the Clark Fork. And so you just slowly enjoy life's unfolding as you then would head up into the mountains for, what we go to the mountains for, and berry season coming, later. So that whole area is just full of resources, a lot of camas, and foods everywhere. To the east, but between Deer Lodge and Flint Creek area, in the Flint Creek Hills, the Salish called that the Deer Cache Hills. The deer were so predictable there; it was like they were cached. They knew they could always get food there. Before I get to back up, there's a man named Eugene Manley, and I'm sorry, just couldn't find a photo from my collection, who he came from an interesting background. His family settled at what's known as Dooley's Corner, and it's near Eyebrow Mountain. And his great-grandmother, Annie McMurray, came west in a wagon train in 1867, and she died on the trail. So her 10-year-old daughter was taken to the Jesuits at St. Ignatius to be educated. And the story varied a couple times, so I'm not exactly sure about her age, but somewhere around 10 years old and somewhere around 14, she married a man named Pat Dooley, and they moved to Flint Creek. Anybody here ever heard about Pat Dooley? Because he had an interesting history in that, he raised draft horses and sold them back east and was quite well known for that. But he was killed by his neighbor Milroy over water rights. The building still stands over there with the bullet holes in it. So Eugene's dad was born in 1893. And when he was 10 or so, Indians would camp at their place and visit his mother, whom they knew from St. Ignatius Mission. One time, a woman in the village there took a leather thong about 3 feet long and measured his feet, tying knots at certain places, and then the next year when they came back, brought him a beautiful pair of moccasins. So his mother had lived in Deer Lodge, and she remembered the Flatheads coming to the area to hunt and gather. And cattle in that area died from grazing within the smelter zone. And Indian women would come and harvest the hides because they weren't getting any of their own from fresh meat. So from toxic animals, they were harvesting the hides. Eugene told me about a man named Monroe Hanna. Anybody ever hear that name? His story would not generally make it into the history books because he was just like a little blip, but one of these characters who helps us understand what was going on in Montana at the time, kind of the grist of Western history. His folks died when he was a young child, and the story is so vague, and he went with the Indians as an adult around 1870. So if his family was here in the 1850s, there weren't that many white people around. So I'm not sure the history, or if his mother might have been Salish, and so he went with the Indians because his father died or what. But anyway, he ended up settling on Flint Creek in 1870 and bought a ranch in exchange for a .33 rifle, a horse, a saddle, chaps, and a poke of gold. So that was the cost. He never married, never learned to read or write, and ended up living in the livery stable in Drummond. He's buried in New Chicago. So as part of my research, I read Dusty Hilmo's account of the hogback bison. Some of you know this story? I think it's in that Rock Creek history book by Darlene Olson. Briefly, through the years, over 100 skulls of bison were counted as coming out of the area between the hogbacks and Upper Rock Creek. There's a hogback cabin up there. Some of you might have stayed. It's for rent by the Forest Service now. So it's like, whoa, 100 bison skulls, was it a kill site? But nobody ever saw any artifacts and no butchering marks. And again, it's one of these stories that if 3 or 4 people didn't tell some version of it, it would be hard to know what happened. But the story coming together is that it turns out there was an old fur trapper who settled, a French fur trapper who settled in Flint Creek, and he remembered 1846 as the worst winter ever, 46, 47. And then somebody else put together anyway that the Salish used to kind of cache bison from the Flint Creek area, drive them up into that Upper Rock Creek area for the winter, and that winter the conditions were so horrific that those bison got drifted in and then iced up and couldn't get out. And there's an account on the Columbia, kind of near Tri-Cities, where something similar happened over there, but I think it was a little later, and it was with cattle and horses, but this terrible description of animals that the conditions changed and it turned to ice, and they just literally couldn't move out of there. And lots of stock animals died in the Bitterroot also, in that later account. But that goes along with the story that's in Sleeping Buffalo about West Side bison, because most of us think about bison, everybody went to the other side of the mountains to hunt, right? So how come there were 100 bison right there? And it turns out there are bison remains all over the place, in the Missoula Valley, in the Bitterroot Valley. And George Catlin drew a map in 1832 of the extent of bison, and there are a couple of places, just like two along the Continental Divide, one in Idaho that would be near Lemhi Pass, and then the upper Clark Fork area where the passes are gentle enough. As long as there is grass, the bison didn't care which side of the divide they were on, right? So, yeah, there were bison, but that group of the Rock Creek area didn't fare very well, and that would have been a tough time for the tribes too. That allowed them to hunt here without having to go conflict with the Blackfeet during that time. Tough times. So Pat McDonald was one of my major sources of information. Their family ranch is real close to Peaburg, out in the middle of the valley, and his grandfather, I think, was an 1880 homesteader, and Pat was one of those kids who tagged along. And he remembered a story about Indians coming with 300 or 400 horses, and his grandpa traded them a load of hay once for a rifle. He got an old Savage rifle for, he traded his rifle. He traded them a load of hay and got back that rifle. So Pat McDonald and Eugene Manley shared with me a story that made a huge difference on the settlement for the Arco case. And that was, they were reminiscing stories they'd learned from their granddads. And Pat said, yeah, my grandpa said that he used to trade for smoked fish. The Salish would be there, they'd be camping, they had a lot of, it was a commercial operation of trading smoked fish. And I said, well, what were they trading for? He goes, oh, I'm not sure. And Eugene said, well, my grandpa said they really liked pork. So there's an archaeological site in that valley, not far from where we were standing, that had been excavated. And I had looked at the collection, and it was a collection of the site. I was told that there was no white settlement, or nobody was living there, but there was a lot of cut pork bone. And I'm like, I'm not getting this. This looks like white people's trash. And that put that story together. They were trading for pork ribs, and they were exchanging their smoked fish. So it explained the archaeological part of it, but more importantly, it said that not only did the tribes lose an individual fishing right, they actually had a commercial. Part of their income was based on this kind of commercial operation, and so that upped the ante for their settlement, which was so cool. And just think about the fluke of that. If those two men hadn't been jarring each other's memories, that story would not have come forward. I spent a long morning in the Peaburg Cemetery on a day much like this, one April, and we're looking at the Chinese part of the cemetery, unmarked graves, and he goes, yeah, that's the Chinese area, and I think there were some native burial in that area as well. Just going to really quickly mention a couple of the people buried there. Is Agnes Morgan, and now the place she lived in Upper Rock Creek is also now one of the homestead cabins that you can rent from the Forest Service. The Morgan Case, yeah. I just think it's really interesting that it says she was very neighborly and well-liked, and how, that was a way of talking about a black person, right? That you wouldn't say that about anyone. It was sort of like, even though she was black, she was really nice and we liked her. And just the difference in time, right? She was an unusual person, an incredibly unusual person, right? To escape slavery and come west with the army as a cook and cooking for Custer. And then after that demise, she made her way out and then ended up with a really good life up in Upper Rock Creek. And then these are the 3 miners that got killed up at, it's variously called either McKay or Maki Gulch, that I mentioned earlier. And this is going to lead to the last story I'm going to tell. I think I had a couple more, but I know we're getting late. So Buzz Hess is one of the people I met at one of our story circles, and he was full of stories, and one was about how Andrew Garcia came to his family's mining claim when he was a kid. Now this story is in Sleeping Buffalo, so some of you might have read it. Anyway, I really wanted to learn more about this. He would light up talking about Andrew Garcia as this, visage out of the Old West. And Garcia was writing Tough Trip Through Paradise at the time, and he wanted to come back up to see where it had all happened. And so those of you, how many of you have not ever read Tough Trip Through Paradise? Mason, you have not read this yet? Buddy, come on. My 8-year-old grandson has not read it. Anyway, that must mean most of you have read this incredible book, and some of us many times. It's such an incredible read. Well, he has this near disaster in Upper Rock Creek because he does a very foolish thing, and I recount that in the story. But years later, when he's writing his memoir that became the book, he wants to make sure he's got his lay of the land memory correct. So Buzz Hess's father had as far as I understood from Buzz, that was they had the lease on this mining claim, and so he came up there. From Buzz's description, I thought maybe he'd spent the whole summer with the family, and it had been a life-changing time for him. Well, when I started digging into the record, so I have this story, but usually I like to make sure there's some kind of corroborative or something that expands our understanding of what somebody's memory is, because we all know how that goes. There often are a lot of other things that come forward. So when you hear Buzz talk about it, this is the man he remembered. And I just remember, he said he stood tall and wore, like long something, and I don't know if it was buckskin or like one of those black long coats people used to wear. But it turns out that he was there a short time, and that what I learned in digging into the record was that Buzz himself was an orphan at that time. He was called the ambulance baby. He ended up being raised by his grandparents because his mother died of peritonitis about 9 months after he was born. But they lived near Superior and couldn't get to the hospital in Missoula in time. They had to take the train, and then they put him in an ambulance, put her in the ambulance, and he was born there. But then I got the idea that it was with his dad when Garcia arrived, but it turns out his dad had committed suicide the Christmas before this, and he was with his uncle and his cousin instead. And just how people's memories, and then what he shared, but what he most was excited about was that he got to tell Andrew Garcia, we went up to the area on a different day when there wasn't snow, but he got to tell him about this etching in a tree, in the bark of a ponderosa pine. And he took him to see it, and he said he had great remorse because he wanted Garcia to tell him what it meant. And And he said, but I can't show it to you because we were worried that it would weather away and we wanted to save it. So we cut it down and put it in the outhouse. And then the outhouse roof there was something, it ended up ruined. And so he said, but here, I'll sketch you what it looked like and tell you what the explanation was. So Garcia told him it was showing where the trail crossed the creek and that what direction you would go to find their lodges, and there were 3 of them. So the coolest thing in doing the research for that chapter of the book was that Garcia had taken a picture of it, and Bus didn't know it, but it ended up in the Historical Society. So there's the version. But I've never seen a message in a tree like that, and you think the woods were probably full of messages like that in the past. So you can see why I do what I do. This is really fun, So I'm gonna close with Kim Brigham's family. It's from this Jens area. This famous barn, you pass it whenever you're on the Clark Fork. And he thinks that's maybe his aunt on the back of that horse with the woman that I was interviewing named Una Kelson Anderson. But here's is Kim here still? I don't see him. His great aunt, Frances, was a wonderful source of information about that area. And you drive through there now and it's just like ranching country, and you don't see the richness of it, but they were talking about all of the plant foods in that area and the reason why it was also another major camp spot. Okay, there's Una. You may remember hearing that Una was taken advantage by, I think she was a Jehovah's Witness, and some people in her community ended up having her sign over her property, and it was like a $7 million ripoff or something like that was just gone. I'm probably exaggerating the numbers, but looking for Kim because there he is. 6.5 million. Yeah, just this poor old woman. She was, like quite old when she died, and she was completely taken advantage of. I was going to talk about Garrison Junction, which is such an interesting place. Now you can hardly find the mouth of the Little Blackfoot, right? Have you ever been to it? Actually gone to right where the confluence is? I mean, this is so destroyed by industry, trains and the split highway. And the Salish name for it means where the trail splits. So I'm just going to briefly tell you this and then call it a day. The trail that we would now think of going to Helena went to the most important red clay source in the region, which Meriwether Lewis called the Crimson Bluff on the Missouri, just past Townsend. And tribes fought for that red ochre. It was so beautiful. And so the Salish called it the Vermilion Road. The Little Blackfoot corridor that became the Mullen Road had been the Vermilion Road. And then they would continue on and go over into the mussel shell country to hunt. And then, just like today, where the trail splits, the other one would go to the upper Clark Fork area and to Deer Lodge. Oh, maybe this is the image I'm going to end up with. There's some cool stuff on that Ferris map showing what people knew in that time period. I'm just going to tease you. How many of you ever seen the Deer's Lodge? We've got some good researchers in this gang. Who else? Come on, I want to know who's cool. It's behind Warm Springs State Hospital, and it has a cupola on top of it now. And it's not even in Deer Lodge County. It's just weird, but anyway. And this one, I don't know if this ever really happened, but in somebody's mind it did. So this is at the museum in Anaconda, and I just couldn't help but take a picture of it. And the Salish called it Momo, terrible pronunciation of it, meaning where smoke comes out. And so they kept calling that area that because the stack, the smoke came out. they used to go up to the upper area for all sorts of resources that they had to stop because of the pollution. And then, but the Shoshones called it the Deer's Lodge because deer were so often grazing and licking the mineral salts from the mineral accretion mound. And that brings up a whole nother thing about the Shoshone representation in that part of Montana. It's a whole nother story. Have to save it for another time. Thank you. I don't know where we are, if there's time for questions. No, there's 10 minutes left if anybody wants to ask anything or tell me anything.
Yeah, Gary and Dennis are going to be bringing the microphones around, so if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and get the mic first. Where's Dennis? There he is. Go. Any questions?
Comments? I think we're good. People have been here long enough. No, we got one.
Could you tell us where that cemetery is, where one of Custer's cooks is buried?
In the Phillipsburg Cemetery.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate all of you coming out on such a beautiful afternoon, and see you again.